10 military 4x4s that never needed armor plating to earn the name tank. No turrets, no treads, just rugged chassis, locking axles, and engineering so tough that some of these vehicles are still working decades after the wars they were built for ended. A few of them you'll recognize, most of them you won't. Let's start at number 10. Number 10. Bantam BRC-40. Before the word Jeep meant anything, a company almost nobody remembers had already solved the problem. In the summer of 1940, the US Army needed a lightweight reconnaissance car and gave manufacturers just 49 days to deliver a working prototype. American Bantam, a small Pennsylvania firm in Butler that was barely staying afloat, took the bid nobody else wanted. Its chief engineer, Carl Probst, sketched the design in a single weekend, and the finished prototype rolled into Camp Holabird, Maryland, on time, riding on an 80-inch wheelbase and powered by a 45-horsepower Continental four-cylinder engine. Before Willys, before Ford, before any of the names that would go on to define the category even had a running vehicle to show, the Army loved the design. What Bantam didn't have was the production capacity to build it by the tens of thousands, so the government quietly handed the blueprints to Willys and Ford so they could build their own competing prototypes, the Quad and the Pygmy. All three vehicles went through grueling side-by-side trials, and while Ford's Pygmy was eliminated early, Willys ultimately edged out Bantam's own BRC-40 on engine torque and off-road performance in the final evaluation, winning the contract that would put its name, not Bantam's, into the history books. Bantam built a little over 2,600 BRC-40s, many of which were shipped overseas through Lend-Lease to Britain and the Soviet Union, before the company was cut out of its own invention entirely. It spent the rest of the war building Jeep trailers instead, and was eventually absorbed into American rolling mills in the 1950s. Fewer than 2 dozen BRC-40s are known to survive today, scattered mostly across military museums and private collections. But look closely at any wartime Jeep or any light tactical 4x4 built in the 80 years since, and you're looking at a shape this forgotten company drew first, in a single weekend, for a fee of $171,000. American Bantam wasn't some untested startup gambling on a long shot. Either, it had reorganized out of bankruptcy in 1936 after starting life as American Austin, and by 1940 it was scraping by on razor-thin margins, which made the Army's 49-day deadline look less like an opportunity and more like a company's last chance to matter. The original tender specification was brutally exact: all-wheel drive, an 80-inch wheelbase, a 47-inch axle track, and a maximum weight of just 590 kilograms, for a contract worth $171,000. Every other manufacturer who looked at those numbers passed. Bantam didn't have that luxury. Number 9. Minerva TT. When Belgium rebuilt its military in the years after the Second World War, it didn't design a new light 4x4 from scratch, it licensed one. In 1951, the head of the Minerva company approached Land Rover's parent, Rover, about building the Series 1 under license for Belgian and NATO service, and by the following year, Rover was shipping complete knockdown kits: chassis, 2.0-liter engine, transmission, and axles to Minerva's plant in Mortsel for local assembly. But Minerva's engineers made one significant change, where the original Land Rover used an aluminum body over a steel frame to save weight and fight corrosion. The Minerva TT went almost entirely steel, right down to body panels Rover had only ever stamped in aluminum. That decision made the vehicle roughly 150 kilograms heavier than the Land Rover it was copied from, and it gave up some of the aluminum body's rust resistance in the process. Land Rover itself would later lean the opposite way with its own armored SAS variant, adding weight for protection rather than durability. But the Minerva's extra mass bought something the SAS truck's armor never had to prove: everyday toughness for regular infantry hauling gear, weapons, and supplies over rough Belgian, Korean, and Congolese terrain, not just Special Forces raids. Roughly 8,500 to 9,000 Minervas were eventually built, and Belgian units carried them through UN service in Korea and later into the chaos of the Congo crisis in the early 1960s. Minerva stopped building vehicles entirely by 1956, and the TT never saw the export success or cultural footprint of the Land Rover it was based on. But the Belgian army kept its Minervas running for decades longer than anyone at the factory likely expected. Nearly 2,500 were still in active service as late as 1985, only finally retired when Belgium adopted a licensed version of the Volkswagen Iltis, a footnote to a much more famous name, built to simply outlast the vehicle it copied. The licensing arrangement itself was a genuine partnership rather than a simple knockoff operation. Minerva's own sales literature claimed 63% of the parts in each vehicle were of Belgian origin, and the company built its own steel body from scratch to Rover's chassis dimensions, rather than merely assembling foreign kits. Even the exterior details told a story of quiet, practical redesign. Minerva swapped Land Rover's rounded rear tailgate for a simpler drop-down panel with a swing-away spare wheel mount, a change that made the vehicle cheaper to press in steel, but gave it a rear profile that looked more like an American Jeep than its British sibling. Ever heard of Minerva before this video? Drop a yes/no below. Number 8. ARO M461. Romania's ARO M461 started from the same basic playbook as the Soviet Union's own light military 4x4s. Quite literally, since its direct ancestor, the 1957 IMS-57, was built almost parts for parts from a Soviet GAZ-67 chassis wearing a GAZ-69 body. Romanian engineers weren't shy about admitting the debt, but they didn't just keep copying the formula either. Facing the Carpathian Mountains as home terrain, rather than the flat steppe the Soviet designs were built around, they redesigned the platform from the ground up in 1964, stiffening the leaf springs, reinforcing the ladder chassis, and fitting a new 2.5-litre, 70-horsepower engine that traded outright power for better climbing torque and fuel efficiency at altitude. The result was a vehicle that mountain infantry units reportedly preferred over the standard-issue GAZ alternatives available through the Warsaw Pact. Not because it was more advanced, but because it was simply stiffer and less prone to breaking under sustained abuse on steep, rocky grades. It backed that reputation up on the world stage too. M461s entered and won class honors at European off-road rallies like the 1970 Forest Rally in Belgium, events where Land Rovers and Jeeps were the usual class of vehicle expected to dominate. The ARO M461 never had the production numbers or the geopolitical spotlight of its Soviet cousins, but it quietly outproduced most of them anyway. More than 80,000 were built by 1975, with nearly 47,000 exported to markets as far off as China and Colombia. Long after the Warsaw Pact that fielded it dissolved, versions of it kept working in Eastern European military, agricultural, and forestry fleets, and a small but devoted owners club in Romania still keeps several thousand running on the road today. That mountain-first design philosophy paid off in a way most of ARO's competitors never managed. The company kept the same basic ladder chassis formula in production for 18 years, refining it in place rather than replacing it outright, at a time when most rival militaries were cycling through entirely new vehicle generations every decade. The M461 name itself was practically an engineering diary, the 4 marking the 4th prototype that actually ran, and the 61 marking the year the project began, 3 years before the finished truck ever reached a customer. Some of that competition success came at events most people wouldn't associate with a Warsaw Pact military vehicle at all. The 1973 Sons of Beaches rally in Oregon, for instance, where a boxy Romanian utility truck built for Carpathian goat trails found itself lined up against American and Japanese off-roaders on their own turf, and held its own, which mountain terrain 4x4 on this list viewers think would win a head-to-head climb. Number 7. AMC M422 Mighty Mite. By the late 1950s, the Marine Corps had a problem the Jeep couldn't solve: helicopters. As the Corps leaned harder into vertical assault tactics built around the Sikorsky H-19, a helicopter with a strict 2,650-pound cargo limit, including crew and fuel, they needed a light 4x4 that could actually fit under that ceiling. And a standard M38 Jeep, at well over half a ton, simply didn't. The project that became the Mighty Mite started with an even stranger idea. Engineers first tried adapting an air-cooled Porsche 356 flat-4 engine, only to discover that using foreign-built hardware violated regulations requiring US-made components in US military vehicles. The fix came from American Motors, which happened to be developing a lightweight aluminum V4 for a cancelled economy car, a dead-end design that found new life powering a battlefield vehicle instead. The finished M422 weighed just 1,700 pounds, built almost entirely from aluminum down to its air-cooled engine, and rode on independent suspension at all four corners rather than the solid axles nearly everything else on this list relies on. A genuinely more advanced setup than anything Detroit was fielding for the military at the time, including inboard brakes and front and rear limited slip differentials borrowed from passenger car engineering, not truck engineering. That kind of purpose-built specialization was rare for a military vehicle of its era, and it worked exactly as intended. A single H-19 could sling-load a Mighty Mite into terrain no road ever reached, then carry it right back out again. The Mighty Mite's specialization was also its downfall, at over $5,000 per unit against a standard Jeep's fraction of that cost. And delicate compared to the vehicles it served alongside, its entire reason for existing quietly disappeared once the Bell UH-1 Huey arrived with more than 1.5 times the lift capacity of the helicopter it had been built around. Production ended after barely 3 years and around 4,000 units, and the M422 faded into one of the more obscure footnotes in American military vehicle history, out-engineered by its own era's aircraft. The project's roots went back even further than most people realize. Initial development work on what would become the Mighty Mite started as early as 1946, under a team that included 4 of the original engineers who had built the Bantam BRC prototype a few years earlier. That lineage shows in the details. The Mighty Mite was the first American military vehicle built with an aluminum body, at a curb weight of 1,700 pounds, still about 100 pounds heavier than the World War II German Kubelwagen it was implicitly competing against on the world stage, but dramatically lighter than anything the US military had fielded before or since. Which vehicle on this list would you least expect to see hanging under a helicopter? Number 6. Beijing BJ212. The Beijing BJ212 doesn't trace back to a single influence. It's a literal parts-bin hybrid, and an unusually well-documented one. After the Sino-Soviet split cut off Chinese access to the Soviet Gaz-69 in the early 1960s, the Beijing Automobile Works needed a replacement fast. Engineers pulled the chassis, axles, and suspension straight from the outgoing Gaz-69 design, then sourced the engine from the Dongfeng Hong BJ760 sedan, itself a homegrown copy of the Soviet Gaz-21 Volga's powerplant, while shaping the body with a boxy, flat-paneled silhouette that echoed the Willys-style Jeeps still circulating from decades of American Lend-Lease vehicles. The result looked enough like the Soviet UAZ-469 that would debut a few years later that some historians suspect Chinese engineers had early access to those blueprints too, though this is unconfirmed. What makes the BJ212 unusual on this list isn't its patchwork origin, it's its staying power. Formally adopted as standard Chinese military equipment in 1966, it remained the primary vehicle of the People's Liberation Army all the way into the 2000s, decades after most of its contemporaries had been pulled from service everywhere else in the world, and outlasting even its more famous 1980s joint venture successor, the AMC-built Beijing Jeep Cherokee, in frontline utility roles. It never had the reputation or the export presence of the Jeep or Land Rover lineages it borrowed pieces from, and outside of China, it's barely known at all. But variants carrying the BJ212 name are still in production today, having been continuously built and rebuilt under different model codes for close to 60 years, a hybrid built from other people's engineering that quietly outlasted nearly all of the originals it was assembled from. The BJ212's engineers weren't shy about acknowledging where each part came from, either. Internal Chinese records from the period describe the vehicle plainly as a combination of proven foreign engineering rather than an attempt at original design, at a moment when Beijing's military planners cared far more about getting a working replacement into service quickly than about claiming credit for it. That practical, unglamorous approach to engineering may be exactly why the design refused to die. BJ212-derived vehicles have now been continuously updated and resold under names like Zhangqi and Guangzhou well into the 2020s, with a modern turbocharged version unveiled as recently as 2024, still wearing a silhouette that traces straight back to a 1965 mashup of Soviet and American ideas. Guess which decade the BJ212 finally stopped being produced? Number 5. DKW Munger. When West Germany rebuilt its military in the mid-1950s, it ran a genuine competition for the job, rather than handing it to an established name. DKW went up against proposals from Porsche and Goliath, both of which pitched more conventional four-stroke hunter's car designs. DKW, a company known mainly for small two-stroke civilian cars and vans, won anyway. The Munger that resulted borrowed its running gear from the DKW 3.6 sedan and the Schnelllaster van, running on a three-cylinder, two-stroke engine that started at 896 cc and 27 kilowatts, the kind of engine note that sounds more like a motorcycle than a tactical vehicle, paired with permanent four-wheel drive and a reduction gear system that gave the little truck 8 forward speeds and 2 reverse at a time when many rivals still relied on selectable, part-time drive systems. That mismatch between sound and substance became the Munger's quiet party trick. Despite an engine note that invited ridicule, the permanent four-wheel drive layout let it claw through deep mud and snow that stalled out far heavier, far more serious-looking trucks in the same convoy. And on the other side of the Berlin Wall, East German border guards were driving the Trabant, a two-stroke vehicle built by the very same engineering lineage, in an odd bit of Cold War symmetry neither side likely appreciated. Bundeswehr units that initially doubted the little two-stroke found it kept moving long after more powerful vehicles had bogged down, and nearly 46,750 were built between 1956 and 1968, supplying not just the army, but border police, forestry services, and fire brigades. The Munger's run ended in the late 1960s, replaced by the more powerful and more conventional Volkswagen Iltis, a vehicle whose own four-wheel drive system would go on to influence Audi's Quattro. But for over a decade, this odd, buzzing little 4x4, built on a name meaning multi-purpose universal cross-country car, quietly did the job while looking like it shouldn't have been able to. DKW didn't invent its two-stroke approach for the Munger. It was drawing on nearly 3 decades of the same engineering tradition the company had used in its motorcycles and small cars since the 1920s, which is exactly why the finished military vehicle sounded, and in some ways drove, like an oversized scooter rather than a purpose-built army truck. That heritage became a punchline among soldiers who'd grown up around heavier four-stroke Kübelwagens and Jeeps, right up until the moment they watched the little Munger keep crawling forward through mud that had already swallowed a much bigger truck's wheels to the axle. Would you trust a two-stroke lawnmower engine to get you through a war zone? Comment below. Number 4. Austin Champ. Most military 4x4s on this list were built to be cheap, simple, and easy to fix in the field. The Austin Champ went the opposite direction entirely. Developed from 1947 under a British War Office project, and eventually built at a converted aircraft factory in Birmingham, it was powered by a purpose-built Rolls-Royce B40 engine, 2.8 litres, 80 horsepower, sealed tightly enough to wade through water nearly 2 meters deep using a fold-up snorkel, and fitted with a gearbox offering 5 reverse gears matching its 5 forward gears exactly, achieved by routing drive through a rear differential that itself contained a reversing gear. The independent suspension, using longitudinal torsion bars at all 4 corners, was designed by a young engineer named Alec Isagonis, who would go on just a few years later to design the original Mini. It was, by most accounts, a genuinely brilliant piece of engineering. Brilliant enough that when Rolls-Royce itself couldn't keep pace with demand for the 15,000 unit contract, it had to license Austin to build a nearly identical engine under its own name just to meet military orders. But it was also wildly overcomplicated and expensive for what the British Army actually needed day to day. Maintenance in the field required specialist knowledge most unit mechanics simply didn't have, and the cost per vehicle dwarfed the alternative quietly taking shape at Rover's own factory, a much cruder, far cheaper vehicle called the Land Rover. Developed in the very same year the Champ program began. Within a few years, the British Army had largely replaced the Champ with that Land Rover, which did the basic job well enough without the Rolls-Royce pedigree, ending Champ production by May of 1956. The Champ's ambitious engineering became its undoing, but it's exactly that overreach that makes it a favorite among today's military vehicle collectors, who prize it as one of the most technically ambitious light 4x4s any army ever fielded, 5 reverse gears and all. 5 reverse party trick came from an unusually elegant piece of engineering. Rather than adding a second gearbox, Austin's designers built the reversing gear directly into the rear differential itself, so the same 5-speed, all-synchromesh transmission simply ran in either direction depending on which way that differential was set. It was the kind of solution a purist engineer would admire, and a field mechanic trying to fix it in the rain with a stripped-down toolkit would curse. Isagonis reportedly carried lessons from the Champ's torsion bar layout directly into his later work, giving one of the 20th century's most influential small cars a distant, unlikely cousin in a half-ton military truck. 5 reverse gears, over-engineered genius or over-engineered mistake? Comment your take. Number 3. GAZ 69. The GAZ 69 wasn't designed to impress anyone. Development began in 1946 under chief designer Grigory Wasserman, tasked with replacing the wartime GAZ 67 with something that used less fuel while staying just as tolerant of terrible fuel. The finished engine ran a deliberately low 6.2:1 compression ratio, specifically so it could burn the low-grade gasoline that was often all Soviet and Allied units actually had access to. A design compromise most Western manufacturers of the era wouldn't have accepted at any price. Everything about the GAZ 69 prioritized survivability over sophistication. The body panels were cut from heavier steel gauges than comparable Western vehicles, sacrificing weight and fuel efficiency in exchange for a vehicle that could absorb damage a lighter design simply couldn't. The finished truck weighed in around 1,550 kilograms, several hundred more than a contemporary Land Rover of similar size. It was, by most measures, a cruder vehicle than its Western counterparts, and it showed. Acceleration was leisurely, the ride was harsh, and creature comforts were essentially non-existent. But crude proved durable, and it proved exportable. Between Soviet and later Ulyanovsk production, more than 634,000 GAZ 69s and its 69A variant were built between 1953 and 1972, distributed to 56 countries, and license-built as far afield as Romania's ARO line and North Korea's Kangsang 68. Decades after production ended, examples are still running in rural regions across the former Soviet Union and beyond, kept alive not by careful preservation, but by the same low-maintenance simplicity that made them ubiquitous in the first place. Running on the same forgiving, low-grade fuel they were designed around from day one. GAZ's own chief designer had cut his teeth on the GAZ 69's direct predecessor, the wartime GAZ 67, which itself had been assembled from spare parts scavenged off half a dozen other Soviet vehicles just to get a working prototype into the field during the war. So the GAZ 69's obsessive focus on using common, forgiving components wasn't a design accident. It was inherited philosophy. That philosophy proved durable enough to survive the Soviet Union that built it. Number 2. Steyr Puch Haflinger, weighing in at around 635 kilograms, light enough that 4 people can lift it by hand, and lighter than some modern golf carts. The Steyr Puch Haflinger doesn't look like it belongs on a list of tank-tough military vehicles. It was born out of a straightforward problem. By the mid-1950s, the Austrian army was still running surplus American Willys MB and Ford GPW Jeeps left over from the war, and wanted something modern, locally built, and suited to the Alps rather than the desert. Engineer Eric Ledwinker's answer wasn't brute strength. It was a central backbone chassis paired with portal axles, a configuration where the axle sits above the wheel hub rather than through its center, dramatically boosting ground clearance without adding height to the whole vehicle, combined with a rear-mounted air-cooled 643cc flat-twin engine, making just 30 horsepower, but driving fully independent swing-axle suspension at both ends. That combination let the tiny Haflinger climb terrain that stopped vehicles many times its size and weight dead in their tracks. Austrian Alpine troops used it on grades and surfaces that would strand a Jeep or a Land Rover, narrow mountain paths, loose scree, and steep switchbacks where a heavier, wider vehicle simply couldn't find traction or clearance, and it found a similarly devoted following well outside the Alps, adopted by the Swiss, Australian, and British armed forces for exactly the same reason. Production ran until 1974, with roughly 17,000 built, and the Haflinger never saw combat in any major conflict. Its real proving ground was the mountains it was purpose-built for. Today, it has one of the most dedicated cult followings of any vehicle on this list, prized by off-road collectors, specifically because nothing else this small, this light, or this strange-looking can climb quite like it does. Steyr Daimler Puch didn't stumble into the portal axle layout by accident either. The same engineering team would later reuse the concept on a much larger scale for the Pinzgauer troop truck, proof that the Haflinger's tiny, odd-looking solution to ground clearance was considered good enough to scale up rather than replace. And the Haflinger's low weight cut both ways. It wasn't just easy to lift out of ditches by hand. It could also be parachute dropped or slung beneath a helicopter far more easily than anything else built to carry troops and cargo through mountain terrain. That same low weight meant a damaged Haflinger rarely stayed stuck for long, where a bogged-down Land Rover often needed a winch or a second vehicle to pull it free. 4 soldiers could simply pick the Haflinger up and carry it to firmer ground. Would you trust a 600 kg vehicle over a full-size truck on a mountain pass? Comment yes or no. Number 1. Volkswagen Iltis. Most of the vehicles on this list influenced each other. The Volkswagen Iltis influenced something almost nobody expects from a boxy military runabout, one of the most celebrated performance drivetrains in automotive history. Built to replace the aging DKW Munger in Bundeswehr service, the Iltis was developed almost entirely inside Audi rather than Volkswagen proper, using a 1.7-litre 75 horsepower engine sourced from the Passat, a gearbox borrowed from the Audi 100, and a four-wheel drive system engineered for reliability in the worst conditions West German testers could throw at it. It beat out a competing bid from the pricier Mercedes-Benz G-Wagen to win the military contract, with roughly 9,500 units eventually built between 1978 and 1988. The connection to Audi's Quattro wasn't some vague inspiration. It happened on a frozen lake. While Audi engineers were running winter testing for front-wheel drive prototypes in Scandinavia, they used a Volkswagen Iltis as their support and chase vehicle, and quickly noticed the little military truck was outperforming their own dedicated test cars in the snow. That observation sent Audi's engineers back to the Iltis's own four-wheel drive hardware as the literal starting point for what became the original Quattro system, the same technology that would go on to dominate the World Rally Championship and permanently change how the automotive world thought about all-wheel drive performance cars. As if to underline the point, an Iltis entered by Volkswagen itself won the brutal 1980 Paris-Dakar Rally outright, taking first, second, and fourth place in the same event where Quattro prototypes were quietly being shaken down. The Iltis itself kept working long after that. Bombardier License built it for the Canadian Armed Forces as the Iltis False Bombardier, where it remained in frontline service into the late 1990s, outlasting most of the vehicles on this list by a wide margin. It never had the fame of the system it inspired, but every time a Quattro-badged Audi grips a wet mountain road, it's running on an idea a humble military 4x4 proved first, on a frozen lake, almost by accident. None of this happened by design at Volkswagen's own initiative, either. The entire Iltis program only existed because a planned pan-European Europa Jeep military vehicle collapsed, leaving the West German government looking for a domestic replacement on short notice, and Volkswagen, busy launching the Golf, simply handed the job to its sister brand in Ingolstadt. 10 prototypes, a 4-year development window, and a contract battle against Mercedes-Benz's more expensive G-Wagen later, Audi ended up building a vehicle under someone else's badge that would go on to define its own motorsport identity for the next 4 decades. Did you know a military Jeep alternative basically invented Quattro? Comment if this is new to you. That's 10 military mini 4x4s built like tanks, from a forgotten prototype that lost its own invention, to a 2-stroke oddball nobody trusted, to the vehicle that quietly fathered one of the greatest all-wheel drive systems ever built. If we missed one you think deserves a spot, drop it in the comments. We read every one. Subscribe for more overbuilt machines nobody talks about.